everyone, I'm Anya and welcome back to my channel. So we have reached the end of my series on what I learned about writing from Star Wars. Today I want to chat about 3 writing takeaways that I got from the Star Wars sequel trilogy, so episodes 7 through 9. You can find the links to the other videos on the original trilogy, the prequels, and Rogue One in the description below. So you all know the drill, let's get started. So episode 7, The Force Awakens. I think what this movie did really well, in my opinion, was tapping into nostalgia and familiarity. And basically the question I was asking myself was, why does this movie feel so strongly like a Star Wars movie? And that was a problem that I had with Solo, but not at all with The Force Awakens. And I was wondering to myself why that is, because I really like that aspect of this movie. So the obvious ones is sort of the physical artifacts and objects. I think as an audience member, it's so satisfying to recognize things like the Millennium Falcon or the crashed Star Destroyer on Jakku. And I think it's especially important to notice how these things have sort of grown to become an intrinsic part of the landscapes in the setting. So things like the AT-AT that Rey is living in on Jakku. And then the second thing I think that made this feel so familiar was the thematic concerns. I think it comes back to a lot of questions that we've been looking at throughout the course of the Star Wars saga. So things like finding family, fate versus free will, and even having to let go of a certain vision of yourself and of the people who you love and care about that you've been holding on to. All of these are really familiar questions that we're returning to. And then finally, the atmosphere. I guess this is pretty general, but I think there are a few things about the atmosphere of this movie that we've talked about in my previous videos in this series and that are really trademark Star Wars. So one of those, obviously, is the huge variety of worlds and circumstances and occupations and objects and technology and all of that. And I think it's all tied together by this really familiar visual contrast between the sort of rugged aesthetic of the Resistance or the Rebels and the much sleeker, more modern militaristic Empire or First Order. And I think on that point, it's unlike the sort of 70s, 80s look of the Empire in the original trilogy, the First Order and their design has been updated to reflect what modern day viewers would think of as futuristic. So things are a little sleeker, a little less 70s, but they still retain a lot of the same design elements. So things like the crew uniforms, the sort of layout and look of the instrument panels, and even sort of interior design things like the diagonal windows and those little oval light thingies that they have in the Imperial settings. And then finally, as far as atmosphere is concerned, we haven't really talked about this much before, but music and sound. And I think, honestly, music is one of my favorite parts of the Star Wars movies, so I'm glad we're getting a chance to chat about it now. But I think the music and the sound does a really good job of evoking this both familiar and nostalgic atmosphere, while also building up a new world for audiences to explore. One of the scenes that really stuck with me from episode 7 was the part where Rey is scavenging for parts inside this crashed Star Destroyer, and the first thing that you hear is this echoing silence, and I think that almost represents the fallen Empire. And then you start to hear the music of Rey's theme come in, and it's really haunting and atmospheric, and I think it's one of the most memorable parts of the movie for me, and one of the parts that feels most strongly like a Star Wars movie because of the really amazing way that John Williams uses the music and some of the familiar themes that he calls back to with it. So, I hesitated a little bit to bring this up because it's so hard to capture in writing, but I think the equivalent of it would be the way that you use language, the way that you use descriptions, and the narrative voice and the tone. All of those things are so important to establishing atmosphere. I think that's one of the things that can make a setting feel really familiar and nostalgic for readers. Looking back on the film as a whole, I feel like the thing that bothered me the most was that the main plot line of destroying Starkiller Base, it felt a little bit impersonal. Like all of the emotional impact that was built into the conflict between Kylo Ren and Han Solo, all of that felt a bit separate from the plotline of destroying this base, and not to mention that it was a repeat of not one but 2 previous Death Stars. So all of that just felt a little bit empty and impersonal to me. But that being said, I think I would still rank this among my favorite Star Wars movies. And that's because of the way that they both return to but also put a new spin on these familiar and nostalgic elements. And as a writer, I think this is such an amazing strategy to use, not only if you're thinking about a longer series, but also even a longish book. If you're returning at the end of the book to a location or a setting that maybe you visited, was a home base at the beginning of the book, and you want readers to feel like a homecoming. Okay, so episode 8, The Last Jedi. I think this was a really, really interesting case study of elaborating on your main plot. So one of the big complaints about this movie is that there are so many elements of the plot that don't really connect up, that don't really lead anywhere, that feel a little bit purposeless. And I won't argue with that necessarily, but it did really get me thinking about why that's the case. Like, what was the filmmakers and the screenwriters' intention in making these choices? And when I thought about it, I felt that there was actually a really valuable lesson to be learned from a storytelling perspective from this. And that was about not being afraid to branch out a little bit from your main plot. Here's what I mean by that. I think oftentimes writers and creators feel this really intense pressure to make sure that every single element, every single plot point of a story connects up to the main plot or advances some sort of small goal within the larger goals of the plot. Basically making sure that every single thing is a stepping stone on an unbroken path to the ending. But I think if The Last Jedi had been executed better, it would have been a really, really great example of why you don't necessarily need to think about plot in this like instrumentalized way. So let's dig into this a little more. So we start out with these two main plot threads, which are the Resistance fleet trying to escape from the First Order, and then Rey trying to recruit Luke to help the Resistance. And then meanwhile grappling with her sort of internal struggles and her connection with Kylo Ren. And then Finn and Rose run off to Canto Bight to try to find the Codebreaker and to help the Resistance fleet escape. And I think that's where we can see some really interesting things regarding these tangential plot lines. I think there are a few ways that these sort of tangential plots can be really helpful. The first one is character development. In this case, I'm thinking about Rose. This side plot gives her a lot of space to develop as a character, and for us to get to know her out of the context of the Resistance, which is full of these like larger than life people like Poe, and people who we've been conditioned to think of as being more important characters than her. But by taking her out of that context, we really get a chance to know her as an individual. And the second way I think that these tangential plots can be really helpful is in developing a theme. So in the end, this trip to Canto Bight didn't really work out the way the characters expected. Like, it didn't end up helping the Resistance fleet to escape, but I think it did develop a really important theme of the movie, which is how this sort of flashy, reckless individualism that's embodied by characters like Luke and Poe, that's not always enough to save the day. And so even though this trip didn't really accomplish a concrete goal per se, I think it could have been a really satisfying element of the movie just because it explores that theme. So overall, I think even though this plot line ended up being a dead end, so to speak, as far as the narrative is concerned, I think it's a really great example of how these dead-end plots can make the story richer by exploring things like characterization and themes. Coming back to writing, I've been thinking a lot lately about the expectations, especially of commercial fiction and of YA fiction in particular, and how far you can go in pushing back against them. And episode 8 really got me thinking about these tangential plot lines, because I think events and plot lines that don't connect up with some sort of guiding main narrative is something that's used a lot in literary fiction, but not so much in commercial and YA fiction. And I think I really would want to experiment more with having these plot threads that don't really aggressively advance the main plot. So finally, episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. I think one of the things that I enjoyed most about this movie this time around was the relationships that we see between the characters, and especially the group dynamics between the main trio of Rey, Finn, and Poe. So in the first two movies, we haven't really had much time to see them all together as a group, and even when we do, they haven't had the time to get to know each other and gel as a group. But then finally we get to episode 9, and they have had that time. They feel like a cohesive squad, so to speak, right? They feel a lot more comfortable. They're sort of funnier together, but they are also really supporting each other and building each other up. And really, to me, it felt like we've been waiting for the whole trilogy to get to this point with them. So you're probably thinking, like, why is this important? I think There are a few things. The first is that this kind of more in-depth character dynamic reveals additional facets to the characters. So one is that they don't take themselves as seriously when they're together. So Rey, she's training to be a Jedi. She's really serious about that. All these questions of like good and evil and the Force and what is her responsibility, like all of that, she's really pretty serious, and for good reason. And then on the other hand, you've got Poe and Finn, who are these, now they've advanced to become important generals in the rebellion. People look up to them, they're respected. So all of them sort of take themselves pretty seriously. But then you get them together, and there's this really interesting thing happens, is that they're sort of ribbing each other, like teasing each other. They become almost not childish, but less serious. And I think that helps audiences remember that they're just normal people, normal friends, and I think that's really, really important. And not only that, but I think that this more joking, lighthearted dynamic between all three of them fulfills the same function for the whole movie, so making us feel like the whole movie is not taking itself as seriously, which I think is almost always going to be a good thing. At least for me. I don't know if as a creator I can pull off those very serious, literary works. And so it's really interesting to think about how having this kind of character dynamic and group dynamic can help to alleviate that and not make you feel really stuck up as a creator about your own work. And then secondly, this is a related point, but I think it's really important to call out the fact that this group dynamic brings out vulnerability in these characters, which again is something that they don't really show. And as, warriors and generals, basically action heroes, they often are not expected to show that. But I'm thinking especially of the scene at the end, the celebration scene. They've won, but they've lost a lot on the way to this victory. And that scene of them just holding on to each other, hugging each other, and crying, that's one of the scenes that stuck with me the most about this movie. Those probably 15 seconds, I think, show that this ending wasn't inevitable, and this friendship between the three of them really can't be taken for granted. I think this shows that they're not some sort of invincible superhero team. Even if on their own they sound pretty cool, right? Like the Jedi, the Resistance generals. But this moment sort of takes down that facade, this moment of the relationship and the feeling that is between them. Again, shows us that there's some part of them that is just normal people. So this relationship between the three of them was really helpful to me as a writer, because it shows how you can use character dynamics to reveal new angles to your characters, and especially to sort of humanize really competent characters. I think it was also such a good example of how these small moments between people and these relationships can be so much more memorable and impactful in a story than these really large-scale events like the sort of face-off between Palpatine's armada and the Resistance fleet. Like that, I don't know, it didn't stick with me in nearly the same way as this moment between the three characters who we've been watching them grow, watching them get closer to each other, and now finally see how much they've come to care about each other. And just having that care and having that feeling of characters who are really comfortable with each other almost made me feel the same way about the movie itself. So with that, we've reached the end of my videos on what I learned about writing from my Star Wars marathon. I hope you enjoyed watching these. I certainly had a lot of fun making them, and I would love to hear any of your thoughts about the sequel trilogy as well, so let me know in the comments whether storytelling related, writing related, or not. Thank you all so much for watching, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified when I post a new video. I will see you next time for a video probably unrelated to Star Wars. Until then, take care. Bye.